She hadn't spoken in nearly a year. He'd stopped trusting long before that. No one expected healing. No one expected connection. But when a silent girl met a forgotten dog, something awakened. Stay with us to see how one quiet moment rewrote everything, and if the story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe. The air in northern Colorado hung crisp and still, brushed with the faint scent of dry pine and melting frost. It was late March, the kind of in-between season where snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of fields while the earth beneath it pulsed with the slow, silent promise of spring. Just outside the small rural town of Pinebrook, no more than a scattering of aging houses, a single gas station, and a church with flaking white paint, stood a modest farmhouse with green shutters and a roof slanted slightly to the left, worn by years of wind and time. In its backyard, beneath the wide sky and the thin, swaying limbs of a nearly bare elm, sat a little girl no one in town had heard speak in almost a year. Emily Carter was 8 years old, though her solemn face and the way her shoulders curled inward made her seem older. Her hair was dark brown and tangled more often than not, falling in silent wisps over eyes the color of stormed-over sky, gray, deep, and unreadable. Her skin was pale from long hours spent indoors, and when she did venture outside, she moved with the careful grace of someone afraid to disturb the air around her. She wore an oversized red sweater, hand-knitted years before, with fraying sleeves that swallowed her hands. In her lap rested a sketchbook, its pages worn and smudged. She didn't speak. She hadn't since the accident. Inside the house, a woman stirred a pot of soup with one hand while keeping an ear tilted toward the back window. This was Martha Carter, Emily's maternal grandmother, a sturdy woman in her early 70s with steel-gray hair always pulled into a bun, eyes lined with crow's feet, and a heart that had carried more grief than it was ever designed to. She had once been a school librarian and still carried herself with a sort of gentle authority, the kind that expected books to be returned on time and believed children could be saved with stories and warm tea. After her daughter's death, she had taken Emily in without hesitation. But she had not expected the silence. Emily had been there, in the car, when her mother died. The details were blurry, rain, a curve in the road, headlights, but what stayed was the image of her mother's hand stretched toward her, blood pooling on the seat, and the sound of sirens growing louder as everything else faded. Since then, Emily had not said a single word. Doctors called it selective mutism. Trauma-induced. Reversible, perhaps. But each week that passed, each quiet dinner, each unopened birthday card from school friends, seemed to widen the chasm. The town had grown used to the silence. At first there had been whispers, "Poor girl, she's in shock, she just needs time." Then the whispers faded. Pinebrook wasn't the kind of place that knew how to sit with grief. It was a place of early mornings and hard work, of stubbornness and fences that didn't move for anyone. But Emily sat in the backyard, rain or shine, with her sketchbook. Her drawings were meticulous, haunting. Birds mid-flight, a pair of boots by a gravestone, the curve of a mother's arm around a faceless child. She never showed them to anyone. She never needed to. Drawing was her language now, and the page the only place that still listened. Sometimes, Martha would bring her tea or a warm cookie, setting it gently on the step beside her. Sometimes she would try to speak, telling her what she read in the paper, about Mrs. Dalrymple's runaway rooster, or the new baby born down the road, but Emily rarely looked up. Only once had she reacted, when a neighbor's dog barked through the fence. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but something like curiosity. But it had passed quickly, like wind through dry grass. Martha had once tried to suggest a therapy animal, but the local shelter hadn't had much to offer beyond loud puppies and elderly cats with little patience. Still, the idea stayed with her. She wrote it down on the shopping list pinned to the fridge, circled it twice. That afternoon, as the sun settled low behind the foothills, casting long golden bars across the yard, Martha stepped outside and stood at the edge of the porch. Emily sat as she always did, legs folded, sketching silently. Martha watched her for a moment, her heart pinched in that way it did every time she thought of how her granddaughter's voice had once filled the house with songs about clouds and imaginary wolves. "Emily," she said gently, her voice roughened by the dry air. The girl didn't look up, but her pencil slowed. "I was thinking we might go into town tomorrow. Maybe stop by the shelter. Just to look." There was no answer, no nod. Only the sound of pencil against paper. Martha sighed and sat on the porch swing, letting it creak beneath her. Above them, a hawk cried once before circling higher into the sky. Inside the house, the soup simmered. A photo of Emily and her mother rested on the mantel, her mother, Lucy, all wind-blown curls and easy laughter, holding a smaller, brighter Emily on her hip. Martha had never taken it down. She couldn't. It was all she had left of her daughter. Night fell quietly over Pinebrook, the sky fading into a pale indigo. Emily came inside on her own, sketchbook tucked under her arm. She didn't say goodnight. She never did. But that evening, she left her sketchbook on the coffee table, its top page facing up. Martha didn't open it right away. But when she did, after the girl had gone to bed, she found a single image, a large dog, standing in the corner of a room, watching a little girl sleep from a distance. The dog's eyes were dark and wide. The girl's eyes were closed. But there was peace in it, unmistakable. Martha stared at it for a long time, her hand brushing lightly over the paper. She whispered into the quiet house, "Okay then. We'll go." That night, as the wind whistled gently around the old house and the stars blinked into place, Emily dreamed of fur brushing against her hand and the steady weight of something warm beside her. For the first time in many nights, she did not wake in fear. Outside, the elm tree shifted, its last dry leaves falling to earth like tiny promises waiting to be kept. The Pinebrook County Animal Shelter stood at the edge of town, near the tracks where freight trains sometimes passed through in the dead of night, their horns echoing across the empty plains. The building was a simple cinderblock structure painted an uninspiring beige, with a metal roof that rattled in strong winds and a flickering sign that read, "Hope Haven." Most people didn't look twice when they passed it. Fewer still stopped. Inside, the air smelled of bleach, old kibble, and something faintly sour. A row of kennels lined the left wall, the dogs barking or whining as visitors walked by. All except one, Shadow. Shadow was a 5-year-old male German shepherd, once sleek and muscular, now slightly underweight, his ribs faintly visible beneath a dull gray-black coat. His ears stood erect, but one had a jagged tear at the tip. A long scar ran down the side of his neck, half hidden beneath tufts of uneven fur. He had eyes the color of peat moss, dark, unreadable, and a silence about him that unnerved even the most seasoned volunteers. He did not bark. He did not whine. He sat, always at the farthest corner of his kennel, pressed tight against the cold wall, watching everything but reacting to nothing. No one had walked him in weeks. He wouldn't let anyone close. The only time he moved was when the kennel tech slid in his food bowl, and even then, he waited until the door was latched again before approaching. At the front desk, Rita Hall adjusted her name badge and stared at the clock. She was in her late 30s, short, slightly round, with a halo of chestnut curls always escaping from her ponytail. Her face was kind but tired, perpetually tired, and she wore oversized sweaters regardless of the weather. Most people described her as gentle, though too soft for the job. They weren't wrong. Rita had worked at the shelter for over a decade, ever since her divorce and the death of her first dog in the same year. She believed in second chances, sometimes to a fault. She'd taken home 3 senior cats over the years and still paid out of pocket for the surgery of a one-eyed beagle that no one wanted. She saw something in every animal, even the broken ones. Especially the broken ones. That morning, the shelter's director, a tall, wiry man named Gary Leach with sharp cheekbones and no patience for sentiment, handed her the final list. "These 4 go Friday," he said, tapping a clipboard with his pen. "We've run out of room. And patience." Rita scanned the list. Her heart dropped at the last name. "Shadow?" she asked, voice tight. Gary didn't even blink. 3 months. No improvement. Won't engage. Won't train. We can't keep him here indefinitely. You know the protocol. He was a working dog, she said, almost to herself. He's just shut down. Then he's done, Gary replied. I'm sorry, Rita. I know you get attached, but we're not a sanctuary. If he can't transition, we have to make the call. As he walked away, Rita stood frozen. Then she turned, grabbed a pen from the counter, and wrote a quick note beneath Shadow's name, extension requested, 7 days. She initialed it and drew a quiet breath, knowing Gary would roll his eyes but let it stand. He always gave her one. Later that afternoon, Rita walked the kennel rows, greeting the dogs with quiet words and soft treats. She saved Shadow for last. She crouched beside his gate, not too close, and slid a small piece of dried chicken through the bars. Hi, boy, she said gently. I know you're not ready. But I'm not giving up. Not yet. Shadow didn't move. But his ear twitched. A flicker of response. You don't have to do anything today, she whispered. Just know you're not invisible. She stayed there a few minutes more, then moved on. When she returned to clean the kennels that evening, the chicken strip was gone. That night, Shadow lay curled in the dark corner of his run. The lights in the shelter had dimmed, the noise died down to the occasional shuffle and distant bark. His breathing was steady, shallow. His body bore stories, some told in scars, others only whispered in the way he flinched at metal clanks or turned his head sharply at the sound of boots on tile. He hadn't always been like this. Once, Shadow had worn a badge on his collar. He had ridden in police cruisers, sniffed out narcotics, stood between his handler and danger more than once. But then came the final mission, a raid gone wrong. He had lunged when commanded. He had taken the brunt of a blow that should have struck a human. There was blood. Chaos. And when he woke up in a strange kennel with no handler in sight, no familiar scent, something inside him closed. Since then, he had been transferred between facilities, deemed too unpredictable, too damaged. A working dog without work was, to some, just a liability. But now, someone had written 7 days on his file. And though he didn't understand the words, there was something different in the air. The woman with soft eyes and chicken treats had returned twice in one day. She hadn't pushed. She hadn't forced. She had waited. And waiting, he understood. That same evening, as a drizzle misted over Pinebrook's fields, and wind rattled the windows of the shelter, Rita sat in the break room with a cup of weak coffee and her planner open beside her. She circled Saturday. In her mind, she imagined someone walking through the doors, someone who wouldn't flinch at the silence, someone who could see beyond the scars and the haunted look. Someone who needed Shadow as much as he needed them. She didn't know, of course, that just beyond the ridge on the Carter farm, a little girl had sketched a large dog in the shadows of her dreams. The morning sky over Pinebrook was a pale wash of pewter, soft and overcast, as if the world were still deciding whether to wake or keep sleeping. The road from the Carter farmhouse into town was narrow and cracked, its edges lined with brittle weeds and last autumn's forgotten leaves. Inside the old Ford truck, Martha Carter gripped the steering wheel with quiet determination. She didn't say much. She rarely did on mornings like these. Beside her in the passenger seat, Emily Carter sat with her arms crossed tightly over a faded denim jacket, her sketchbook tucked beneath one arm like a secret. Martha had told her they were just running errands, and maybe stopping somewhere different, just to look. Emily hadn't asked where. She never asked anymore. But something in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, maybe, or the way her gaze lingered on the window longer than usual, told Martha it was the right day to try. The Pinebrook County Animal Shelter was quiet that morning. The rain hadn't come yet, but the sky hung low and expectant, and most visitors preferred to stay home on days like this. Rita Hall was behind the front desk, her sleeves rolled up, filling out intake forms while sipping coffee from a mug shaped like a corgi. Her curls were wilder than usual, and she had a smudge of ink on her cheek she hadn't noticed. The door chimed when Martha and Emily stepped inside, and Rita looked up with a smile, polite, but cautious. Experience had taught her not to expect too much from drop-ins. "Morning," Martha greeted, offering a nod. "We're just looking." Rita stood and wiped her hands on her jeans. "Of course. You're welcome to take your time. Kennels are through here." Emily followed her grandmother without a word. She walked with small, measured steps, her sneakers barely making a sound on the scuffed linoleum. The scent of antiseptic and damp fur hung heavy in the hallway. As the door opened, a cacophony of barking exploded from the kennels, high-pitched yips, deep-throated rumbles, the frantic whine of paws against steel gates. Emily flinched slightly but did not retreat. She simply stood still, eyes scanning the rows of dogs, most of whom leapt or barked in their eagerness to be noticed. Golden mixes, speckled hounds, a droopy-eyed beagle that howled with hope. But Emily kept walking. She didn't glance twice at the excited ones. Instead, her steps slowed as they neared the far end of the corridor, where the last kennel sat apart from the rest. It was darker here, away from the overhead light. In the corner of that pen sat a large dog, unmoving. Shadow. He was curled in a way that suggested both tension and retreat. His eyes, though half-lidded, were alert beneath the heavy folds of silence that cloaked him. He hadn't reacted to the others barking, he never did, but something shifted when the girl came near. She stopped just outside the bars. The noise behind them became a dull murmur, fading in the background like wind behind glass. For a moment, no one moved. Rita, who had been explaining something to Martha about adoption forms, turned and caught sight of them. Her words trailed off. Emily and Shadow stared at each other. No tail wag. No tilt of the head. But the air between them changed. The little girl took one step closer, not tentative, not brave. Just present. Shadow's head lifted slightly. Then, slowly, he unfolded from the corner. His legs were stiff, his gait uneven from the old injury, but he stood. And for the first time in weeks, he moved toward the gate, stopping just short of touching it. His ears were forward, not in aggression, but in quiet acknowledgement. Emily dropped to her knees, her sketchbook still clutched in one arm. Her fingers did not reach through the bars. She did not call out. She simply looked. Rita's breath caught. "I've never seen him do that," she whispered. "Not once." Martha blinked. "What does it mean?" Rita shook her head slowly, eyes wide with something close to reverence. "I don't know. But he sees her." Shadow stood calmly, the tension in his back easing. His eyes, so often guarded, almost flat, seemed to shift, barely, as if recognizing something that hadn't been there before. And Emily, whose own expression usually held the blank stillness of someone lost inside herself, now looked directly into the dog's eyes. Her shoulders relaxed. Her grip on the sketchbook loosened. A soft exhale passed through her lips, almost a sigh. Martha leaned down. "Sweetheart. What do you think?" Emily didn't answer. But she didn't look away, either. Rita knelt beside them, careful not to intrude. "Would you like to sit with him a bit? I can open the viewing gate, just for a minute." Emily's gaze flicked to her, then back to Shadow. She didn't speak, but she nodded. They moved to the private visitation room, a quiet space with a rubber mat, a few chew toys, and a bench along the wall. Rita led Shadow in gently, his leash loose in her hand, her voice soft but firm. He followed, eyes trained not on her, but on the girl sitting cross-legged near the bench. Martha waited just outside, watching through the window. Shadow approached Emily with caution, but no fear. He paused within arm's reach, lowering his head slightly as if asking for permission. Emily raised her hand, slowly, not to touch, but just to show it was empty. Shadow sniffed once. Then he sat. Emily didn't move, but tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She made no sound. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached for her sketchbook and opened it to a blank page. Her fingers, smudged with graphite, began to draw. A girl. A dog. Sitting together. Rita stood at the door, blinking rapidly. She couldn't explain what she'd seen, only that something broken had shifted. Later, as they walked back toward the truck, Martha gently touched Emily's shoulder. "Would you like to come back tomorrow?" Emily looked up. Then, slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Shadow watched them leave from the kennel gate, standing, ears forward, his body relaxed for the first time in months. The sun over Pinebrook rose slowly that morning, breaking through a layer of silver cloud with streaks of soft amber light. A pair of sparrows flitted across the Carter farmhouse roof as the old Ford truck rolled back into the gravel driveway. In the passenger seat, Emily Carter clutched her sketchbook, a faded blue backpack at her feet. In the back, tucked safely behind the grill of a second-hand crate, Shadow lay in a quiet crouch, ears tilted slightly forward, eyes steady. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. But he was awake, and watching. Martha Carter parked beneath the large elm tree that stood like a silent sentinel beside the porch. She got out slowly, her knees stiff from the drive, and opened the rear door of the truck. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and freshly turned earth. She unlatched the crate. "Come on, big guy," she murmured, her voice low, coaxing. Shadow didn't move at first, just blinked once. Then, cautiously, he stepped out. His gait was measured, his body tense but not panicked. He scanned the yard, every fence, every bush, every sound of wind in the leaves. But when Emily stepped beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of his shoulder, he settled. Just slightly. Enough to make Martha's chest ease a little. They led him inside, past the squeaky screen door and through the narrow hallway that smelled of lemon polish and old books. The farmhouse was modest, wood floors, soft rugs, photos of people long gone but never removed. A fireplace, unused for years, sat at the heart of the living room, with a worn leather couch beside it and a basket of yarn left untouched under the window seat. Emily knelt in the corner where she often sat to draw. Without speaking, she opened her sketchbook and pulled out a stub of graphite. Shadow circled twice and laid down beside her. His head rested against the wall, eyes alert but calm. And just like that, the first hour passed. Martha didn't interrupt. She made tea, swept the kitchen, and glanced at them only now and then, afraid the moment might vanish if acknowledged too directly. Shadow's presence in the house changed the rhythm of the days, but not in loud, dramatic ways. He didn't bark when strangers passed the gate. He didn't leap or wag like the neighbor's dog, Jasper, who often sprinted along the shared fence. Instead, he followed Emily. Quietly. Always a few paces behind her, sometimes beside her, but never leading. At night, when Emily went to bed, Shadow would curl on the rug near her feet, lifting his head only when she stirred. The nightmares came like they always did. Images Emily never drew. Sounds she never described. Martha had grown used to the silent cries, soft gasps, clenched fists, breath held tight. But now, when the darkness pressed in, Shadow would rise, pad over, and press his nose gently against her hand or cheek. Not waking her. Just reminding her. By the end of the first week, Emily was drawing more. Pages filled quickly, sketches of paws, the arc of a tail, the slope of Shadow's back as he slept. The lines became less frantic, less heavy. One afternoon, Martha noticed Emily had left a page on the kitchen counter, a drawing of the porch, with Emily sitting beside Shadow under the elm tree, both looking out at the field. The detail was careful. Shadow's scar was there, but softened, like a story already being rewritten. Shadow, too, had changed. His appetite returned, slowly but surely. At first, he picked at his food, sniffing every bite. Now, he ate steadily, and sometimes even lifted his head when he heard the rustle of the kibble bag. When the mail truck came, its usual grumble past the front gate, he stood, but didn't bristle. He simply watched, then returned to Emily's side. By the second week, Martha noticed something new. Emily began humming. Softly. Almost unconsciously. When she sketched. When she brushed crumbs off the table. It wasn't a song, exactly, just small threads of sound stitched between the quiet. And it wasn't much, but to Martha, it was everything. One afternoon, a visitor arrived. Sarah Kim, a tall woman in her late 40s, with shoulder-length black hair streaked with silver and the practical stride of someone who'd grown up on a ranch, stepped onto the porch. She was the local social worker, assigned to Emily's case long before Martha even knew she'd be caring for a grieving child. Sarah had kind eyes but a voice that carried when needed. She wore pressed jeans, sturdy boots, and a light blue jacket with the county emblem on the shoulder. Martha greeted her with a brief handshake. "She's in the back," she said quietly. "Drawing." "He's with her." Sarah nodded. "May I?" Martha hesitated, then opened the door wider. Sarah stepped inside and followed the sound of pencil on paper. When she reached the back room, she paused. Emily didn't look up. She was lying on her stomach, sketching something from memory, a pair of footprints in soft mud, followed by paw prints. Shadow was beside her, half asleep, one ear flicking toward the sound of the newcomer but otherwise unbothered. Sarah crouched beside Martha near the hallway. "That him?" she whispered. "That's him," Martha replied. "Name's Shadow." Sarah watched for a moment longer. "She hasn't spoken, has she?" Martha shook her head. "Not yet. But she's coming back. A little more each day." Sarah straightened. "That's all we can hope for." That evening, as the light turned golden and the sky pinkened behind the hills, Martha brought out 2 chipped mugs of cocoa, one for herself, one for Emily. She found her granddaughter on the porch, curled up beside Shadow, who was watching the sunset with the same focus he gave to everything else. Emily took the mug with both hands, gave the faintest smile, and leaned into the dog's side. Shadow didn't move. He just exhaled, slow and steady, and stayed right there. A pale wind rustled across the Carter farm that morning, stirring the frost-kissed grass in soft, uneven waves. The sky was clear, an open blue canvas scattered with the high trails of geese moving south. Inside the house, the scent of warm bread lingered in the kitchen, but Emily hadn't touched her toast. Instead, she stood at the threshold of the old tool shed, its door creaked open for the first time in months. Martha hadn't meant to send her out there. She'd only asked for the garden spade and a pair of gloves, not realizing the memories that waited behind that door. The shed leaned slightly to the left and smelled of dust, old wood, and rusted iron. A shaft of sunlight pierced through a crack in the roof, casting a golden beam across the cluttered interior, old jars, coils of rope, stacks of brittle newspapers, and in one corner, a small cedar chest covered by a faded blanket. Emily approached it slowly. The chest was low to the ground, no lock, its brass handle worn smooth. Her fingers hesitated, then gripped the edge. With a low creak, the lid lifted. Inside were pieces of a life left unfinished, photographs of a young woman with the same storm-gray eyes, notes written in looping cursive, a pressed flower tucked between the pages of a journal, and near the bottom, wrapped in an old scarf, a leather dog collar, cracked with age, brass tag dulled but legible, rusty. Emily sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, the collar in her lap, the tag cradled in her palm. Her breathing slowed. There was no sound except the steady rhythm of the wind against the metal roof. Her fingers brushed the worn edge of the tag again and again. In one photo, her mother, Lucy Carter, stood beside a young German shepherd, nearly identical to Shadow. The dog was leaping into the air, catching a frisbee mid-flight, all energy and joy. In the background, a tiny version of Emily laughed in a sun hat, arms raised toward the sky. She hadn't remembered the dog. Or perhaps she had, somewhere beneath the rubble of grief and silence. Emily pressed the collar to her chest, her shoulders shaking. Her lips parted, and a soft sound escaped, not a sob, not a cry, but a word. Small and broken, as if it hadn't been used in years. Like. Mom. Shadow, who had followed her in unnoticed, sat quietly beside her, ears low, his eyes fixed on the collar in her hands. He didn't move. He didn't need to. That evening, Martha found her granddaughter curled on the living room rug, the collar still in her grip, Shadow's head resting across her ankle. The old photo album lay open, a few pages wrinkled with faint watermarks. Emily didn't look up when Martha entered, but her voice came, barely above a whisper. He looks like Rusty. Martha's throat caught, but she kept her composure. That was your mama's dog. She got him in college. Said he taught her how to laugh again. Emily nodded, her hand resting lightly on Shadow's back. Shadow doesn't bark. Rusty didn't either. Not much. They sat in silence, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something finally shared. Later that week, on a quiet Thursday morning, Martha drove into town alone. The roads were still damp from overnight rain, and the sky hung low with quiet clouds. She pulled into the gravel lot behind Hope Haven and walked inside with slow, deliberate steps. Rita Hall was rearranging a shelf of leashes and medicine bottles when she saw her. Martha, she said warmly, wiping her hands on her jeans, did everything go all right? Martha nodded, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. Better than all right. That dog. I can't explain it. Rita tilted her head, her face softening. Sometimes the match chooses itself. They sat across from each other in the break room, mugs of coffee steaming between them. Martha told her everything. About the accident. About the night Emily stopped speaking. About the way grief had settled into the walls of their house like mold, silent and invasive. She was in the back seat, Martha said, her voice low. Watched the whole thing. Her mother died before help arrived. Emily just shut down. Like someone turned off the lights inside her. Rita's hand gripped her mug tighter, the weight of the story sinking in. And Shadow? I don't know what happened to him, Martha said. But he knows. That girl wakes up shaking, and he's already there. Like he's been through it too. Rita didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window, where a pair of cats basked in a patch of morning sun near the back fence. Then she said, some scars don't show. Not on skin. Not right away. But they know each other by the way they carry silence. Back at the farmhouse, Emily had taken to wearing Rusty's collar on her wrist like a bracelet, threading a string through the tag. She didn't show it to anyone, but she didn't hide it either. She added a sketch to her wall, the first drawing she ever taped up instead of tucking away. It showed two German shepherds, one older, one younger, walking side by side into a blur of morning light. Shadow lay beside her bed every night, his body rising and falling in sync with hers. And on nights when the wind howled too loud or the dreams grew too sharp, Emily would reach down and rest her hand on his back. And he would stay, steady and real and warm. The smell of fresh mulch and damp lilac lingered in the morning air as the small town of Pinebrook dressed itself for spring. Windows were pushed open. Porches were swept. In the schoolyard of Pinebrook Elementary, children buzzed like bees around blooming dogwood trees, clutching handwritten notes and colorful paper programs that fluttered in the breeze. The annual spring recital was one of the few events in town that brought everyone out, parents, teachers, even the postman in his creased blue uniform. But for Emily Carter, the idea of standing in front of anyone, let alone speaking, was something that once would have felt like being asked to fly. Inside room 6B, Miss Talia Jennings straightened chairs with practiced precision. She was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, always dressed in soft sweaters and long skirts, her curly brown hair tied back in a loose bun. Talia was one of the few people who hadn't given up on Emily, even during the silent months. She had a calm, observant nature, the kind of teacher who noticed which children needed extra time and which ones simply needed space. She turned when she heard the quiet knock. Emily stood in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and beside her, Shadow, tall, dark, composed, sat with perfect posture. He wore a green vest that Martha had sewn herself with careful stitches. Service companion, please ask before petting. His presence had been cleared with the principal weeks ago after a meeting that included Sarah Kim, the social worker, and a long list of reasons why Emily might not be ready. But Ms. Jennings had simply nodded and said, let's give her a choice. Hi, Emily, the teacher greeted gently. Hey there, Shadow. Emily nodded once, not yet ready to speak. Shadow blinked slowly and padded into the room, nose twitching as he surveyed the desks, the bookshelves, the corner filled with beanbags and soft blankets. The rest of the class trickled in, a mixture of excitement and nerves in their voices. Some of them looked at Shadow in awe. A boy named Connor, who always spoke too loudly and asked too many questions, whispered, he looks like a police dog. He kind of is, Talia said with a smile, diffusing the energy. But today, he's just here to help. The recital was scheduled for noon, and the class spent the morning practicing in pairs, adjusting the microphone stand, and nervously rereading their poems. Emily sat in the back, sketching something in the corner of her notebook. Her poem had been finished for over a week, one she hadn't shown to anyone. It was only when Ms. Jennings gently slid a printed program across her desk that Emily saw her name had been left off. You don't have to, the teacher said softly. But we'd love to have you. Even if you just stand beside him. Emily looked at Shadow, who was lying under the desk with his chin on her boot. She pressed her hand to his head. The scars near his ear had faded now, though not completely. She traced the fur there like a worry stone. He didn't move. At 11:30, the gymnasium filled. Rows of folding chairs creaked beneath the weight of proud parents, neighbors, and curious townsfolk. Banners made by the students hung across the walls, painted butterflies, sunbursts, and poems on pastel paper. A small wooden podium stood on the stage, decorated with paper tulips. Rita Hall arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. She wore a slate-gray jacket over a floral blouse, her curls slightly windblown. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, but when she'd heard about the recital from Sarah, something told her she needed to be there. The room hushed as Principal Marlowe, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a deep voice, welcomed everyone and introduced Ms. Jennings' class. One by one, the students read their poems. Some stumbled. Some rushed. Some whispered so softly the crowd leaned forward just to catch the words. Every child was applauded like a hero. Every child was enough. When the last student stepped down, Ms. Jennings returned to the stage. We have one more poem, she said, from someone who has shown us that there's more than one way to speak. A ripple of silence passed through the room. Emily walked slowly onto the stage, not alone, but with Shadow beside her. She wore a plain blue dress and her hair in a low ponytail, and she moved with a kind of focused quiet, like walking a tightrope between two worlds. Her hand rested on Shadow's shoulder, her fingers buried in the fur behind his neck. The microphone stood tall. She adjusted it without being asked. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but every syllable carried the weight of a year buried inside. The friend who didn't ask. He didn't ask me to smile. He didn't ask why I was quiet. He just stayed. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't run from my shadows. He became one. He didn't need my words. He needed my truth. And I gave it to him. In silence. There was no sound when she finished. Just stillness. Someone in the front row reached for a tissue. In the back, Rita wiped her eyes with the cuff of her sleeve, her breath catching in her throat. Ms. Jennings held a hand to her chest, smiling through the ache. Shadow stood completely still, eyes focused on Emily as if the poem had been written for him, and it had. The applause began slowly, respectfully, and then grew, swelling to fill the entire space like sunlight through the gym's tall windows. Emily didn't bow. She simply reached down, took Shadow's collar, and walked off the stage, lighter than she'd been in a year. The morning was colder than usual for late spring in Pinebrook. A thin layer of fog hung over the fields behind the Carter house, softening the edges of the world like a half-forgotten dream. The sun pushed its way gently through the mist, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. From the kitchen window, Martha Carter, now grayer than ever, though still upright and sturdy, watched as a dust-covered black truck rolled to a stop outside the white picket fence. Her hands, worn from years of raising a second child she hadn't planned for, trembled slightly as she set the kettle on the stove. She didn't call for Emily. Some things had to unfold without instruction. The man who stepped out of the truck was tall and lean, but not in a healthy way. His clothes were clean but looked lived in. Faded jeans, boots caked with dried mud, and a tan canvas jacket that seemed too big for his frame. His hair was dark but streaked with gray, a little too long at the back, and a closely trimmed beard lined a face that carried sorrow like an old friend. This was John Carter, Emily's father, who had once been a promising high school teacher before grief cracked his spirit like fragile porcelain. He hadn't seen Emily in nearly 3 years. After Lucy, his wife and Emily's mother, was killed in a car accident, something inside John had buckled. He had left the child, the house, and the silence behind, drowning in guilt he couldn't name and shame he couldn't face. Only now, after hearing from a friend in town that Emily had started speaking again, had he mustered the courage to return. Martha opened the door slowly. Her gaze was sharp but not unkind. She didn't invite him in, not yet. "She's out back," was all she said, then turned back into the house, leaving the door ajar behind her. John nodded, unsure if he had the right to be there at all. In the backyard, Emily was sitting cross-legged on a quilt beneath the maple tree, her sketchbook in her lap. Her hair had grown longer since the last time he saw her, and her posture was more confident, though her shoulders still curled inward when she wasn't paying attention. Next to her, stretched comfortably on the grass, lay Shadow, alert, ears twitching, eyes closed but listening. John didn't call out. He simply walked through the gate, down the worn path, and stopped a few feet away. His boots crunched against gravel. Emily looked up. Their eyes met. Her body stiffened immediately. Her pencil froze in midair. John swallowed hard. "Hi, Emily," he said. His voice was hoarse, and used to softness. "You look so grown up." Emily didn't respond. Not with words. Not with a nod. Just silence. Shadow's head lifted. His eyes scanned John, studying his every move. For a moment, John froze, expecting a growl, a bark, anything. But the dog didn't move, just stared, then slowly blinked, and returned his head to the grass beside Emily, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. That small gesture wasn't missed by Martha, who had quietly stepped onto the porch to watch. Emily shifted, her gaze bouncing between the man and the dog. Shadow's calmness seemed to whisper something only she could hear. She clutched her pencil tightly, then looked at her father again. He wasn't wearing a smile. He didn't force one. He looked exactly how she remembered him, lost and trying. Minutes passed. John sat down in the grass, not too close. He picked at the hem of his jacket, then finally reached into his pocket. "I brought something," he said quietly. He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges. "It's your mom's poetry journal. I found it a few months ago in a box I never opened. I thought, maybe you'd want to read her words in her own handwriting." Emily didn't take it right away. But she didn't look away either. John placed the journal gently at the edge of the quilt and leaned back. Shadow, noticing the motion, stood up slowly and walked to John. The dog stopped just inches away, close enough to sniff, but didn't growl or bare teeth. Instead, he sat down, tail softly brushing the grass, his amber eyes meeting John's without fear. John exhaled slowly, surprised by the acceptance. "You must be the one who helped her find her voice," he said, almost to himself. Emily watched all of it. And then, slowly, so slowly that Martha's breath caught from the porch, Emily reached her hand out across the quilt. Her fingers trembled, paused, then rested gently on her father's wrist. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. John looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "I missed you every day," he said. No reply came. But Emily's eyes were wet, and when Shadow curled back up beside her, resting his head across both of their feet, it was the first time in years a Carter family had sat that close together. Inside the house, Martha finally stepped away from the porch, tears she hadn't expected stinging her eyes. In the kitchen, the kettle was whistling, and the tea would be steeped with more than leaves, it would carry the weight of a broken line slowly being mended. The late spring air held a golden softness as the sun began its slow descent behind the foothills of Pinebrook. Shadows stretched long across the Carter farm, and the tall grasses in the back field shimmered like silk under the light. A breeze stirred the wildflowers, violets, dandelions, and bluebells, and scattered their petals across the ground like confetti from some quiet celebration. Emily stood at the edge of the field barefoot, her sneakers left on the porch behind her. The grass tickled her ankles, and the wind played gently with the hem of her sundress, which was the same pale yellow her mother once wore in the only picture Martha kept on the mantel. Her brown hair was loose, no longer hiding her face, and her gray eyes, once dulled by silence, sparkled as if catching every detail of the afternoon light. Beside her, Shadow waited. His coat had regained its luster, deep black brushed with silver along his spine. The scar behind his ear was still there, but now it was a part of him, like the knotted bark on an old tree, a sign not of damage, but survival. His posture was relaxed, tail swaying gently, tongue lolling from the side of his mouth as he panted softly in the warm sun. Behind them, the screen door creaked open and shut again. John Carter, Emily's father, walked toward them across the yard. He was in his late 30s, tall, lean, with tired eyes that had only recently started to soften. He had a quiet strength in the way he moved, like someone learning how to stay in one place after years of running. His beard was neatly trimmed now, and he wore a faded blue shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong forearms that looked more familiar holding tools than emotion. Since he returned, things had been cautious. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't filled the air with apologies. He just showed up. Sat on the porch steps in the evening. Helped Martha repair a stubborn hinge on the barn door. Cooked breakfast in the mornings, even if Emily didn't eat it. He never pushed. He just waited. That afternoon, however, something had shifted. Emily took a step into the field. Then another. Shadow followed immediately, trotting to her side. She turned to her father and held out her hand. "Come," she said, her voice clear and steady. John blinked once, and for a moment, it seemed like the world stopped turning. Then he nodded, walked forward, and took her hand. Together, the three of them moved out into the tall grass, a strange trio of unfinished stories, walking side by side toward something unnamed. They reached the old stone circle at the center of the field, a place where Martha had once planted tomatoes, where Lucy had once danced barefoot on summer nights, where Emily had once hidden when the world felt too loud. Now, it was just earth and sky. Emily let go of her father's hand and turned toward him. "I want to keep him forever," she said, her voice quiet but sure. John looked at Shadow, who was sitting obediently, ears forward, gaze steady. "He's already yours," he replied. I think he chose you before we ever had a say. Emily smiled, wide, unguarded. She turned toward the horizon, cupped her hands around her mouth, and shouted with every ounce of breath in her chest. Shadow. The name rang out across the field, loud and alive. Birds lifted from the fence line. The grass seemed to shiver. Shadow, startled at first, looked back at her. Then, with a joyful leap, he bounded across the meadow. Emily ran after him, barefoot and fearless, her laughter echoing behind her. Her voice no longer trembled. Her feet no longer hesitated. John watched them go, his hands resting on his hips, tears caught in the corners of his eyes. Behind him, the porch door creaked again. Martha stood there, holding 2 glasses of lemonade, her apron dusted with flour. She squinted into the distance, then smiled. She's not the same girl, John said without looking back. No, Martha replied. And neither are you. The two of them stood together in the hush that followed, not speaking, just watching. The world had not healed overnight. There were still pieces missing. But in that moment, as a girl chased her dog through sun-drenched fields, the air tasted of second chances. Back at the edge of the field, Shadow stopped and turned, his chest rising and falling with deep, contented breaths. Emily reached him, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around his neck. His tail thumped once. Then again. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "You're home." And for the first time in a long time, home didn't feel like a memory. It felt like now. Sometimes, healing doesn't come in grand gestures, it comes in quiet moments, a hand on soft fur, a name spoken after silence. In life, we all carry scars, some we see, some we don't. But maybe, just maybe, all it takes is one soul willing to stay beside us without asking why. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope, like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more. And tell us, have you ever met an animal that changed your life in a way no human could? Let us know in the comments below.